Hello and welcome back to our series of interviews with Euro's colleagues around the world. Today this is a slightly different interview. I'm delighted to introduce you to Simon Johnston of UK Relocation in the UK. Simon is not only the chair of the Association of Relocation Professionals, he's also the chair of TIRA, the International Relocation Associates. And Zurlinden, who, as I'm sure you know, is the CEO of the ARP, the Association of Relocation Professionals UK, and of course Euro. So what we're going to talk about is, I know that Simon and Tad have been working on a project to lobby the British government in order to recognise relocation and mobility as a specific industry of special need. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But first of all, Simon, tell me what's happening in the UK. And I mean that as a serious question. I have not been watching the news for a week. So what's going on? What should I know?
Okay. Well, the situation in the UK is that we've been in sort of semi-lockdown for the last 3 weeks. As of last week, the UK government announced that there'll be a minimum of another 3-week lockdown period, and then they'll reevaluate it. They've come up with these 5 measures, which they are going to actually take as a criteria to actually discuss how we will move out of the lockdown phase. So at the moment, there is no clear indication of when we will move out of where we are at the moment, but we are looking for a minimum of a 3-week period at this time. So for the situation from the UK perspective is that pretty much we are all locked down other than the major supermarkets, hospitals, etc. And so we're all getting very familiar with our homes.
It's true. I mean, what's really interesting, we had a virtual board meeting last week on Friday, and what was so interesting, just talking with each other, was the different approaches that governments seem to be taking in terms of giving people milestones and deadlines. So, for example, Pierre in Switzerland was saying, okay, by this date, we're moving to these shops being open. By this date, it'll be kindergartens, and the same thing in Denmark, same thing in Germany. That's not happening in the UK, is it? And they're quite strict about that.
They're very strict about it, and they're not giving any indication about when we'll come out of this phase. So you look around, particularly Europe, you're actually seeing certain countries be coming out of this already. France and Spain, perhaps not, but others are, plus indications of certain dates, X will happen or Y will happen. That's absolutely not happening in the UK at all. I think we will come later into this, and so therefore we are still in this journey. I suspect it will be quite a while before we will see something close to normality return on the ground in the UK.
I think also, Dominic, that maybe the UK government has taken the view that they don't want to say that we're going to open such and such on May the 4th, only to then turn around and say, oh, sorry, we're not doing that. So, you know, the thing is it's always fine to make promises about what day something's going to happen. But what if you have to eat your words and disappoint everybody? So I don't know, it's sort of 6 of one and half a dozen of the other.
So we're going to do, we're actually going to launch next week an intercultural research project with Sabine Baylock, looking at what decisions governments took, how that was influenced by the culture of the country, and then how the people actually started to accept that. And I think what's very interesting about not being set deadlines in the UK, I mean, obviously the head of psychology in the NHS is on that team. You know, this is not happening without people thinking quite carefully. But it is interesting how, you know, what the reasoning is. Tell me, Simon, when this first began, you were quite into the group of your, let's be honest, your competitors in getting together. Can you tell me how that began and how it evolved?
Yes, so it actually started with a contact from one of our competitors, but an industry friend. So contacted us and said it would be a good idea if a group of TSPs in the UK actually all spoke to each other, recognizing our differences, not talking about clients or trade, but just understanding what is going on to see if we can make better decisions on behalf of the industry in the UK. So 5 relocation companies have got together, and we talk on a regular basis. I think the next call is in about a week or so's time. Tomorrow. And we're sharing what we're seeing on a regular basis. And Tad, you've joined these calls. And what we've done on the back of this is we've recognized that this industry has incredibly low profile. This is a conversation I believe Euro holds very dear as well. But in the UK, it's just not recognized. So we were trying to actually make sure that our local MPs knew about the situation, the size of this industry, how much it impacts on the economy of the UK, why it matters, to try and actually see if we can get some representation from our MPs, other major parties, and ultimately the government to actually recognise and give some additional support to help us through this period where there's quite literally no movement of people, which is obviously the key aspect for any form of relocation to take place.
Fascinating stuff. And what, I mean, how did you go, Tad, I'm going to ask you this, how did you go about, you know, what did you need? You needed figures, I'm assuming.
Well, no, to begin with, it was a case of, I really think that we need to motivate people to get in touch with local MPs. And I sent a letter out to every ARP member asking them to do this. And then we had varying degrees of responses from MPs saying, I suppose in some instances, basically being completely disinterested, and in other situations saying, you know, very nice to hear about you, lovely to know that one of the UK's foremost industries is in the Suffolk region, but I'm busy being the Minister of Public Health at the moment, which is sort of understandable, and I wasn't holding it against that particular person. But the fact is that we needed to take that a bit further, and then Simon and I were having a conversation, and I said, well, let's try and get together some statistics. And so I put together an email asking a few very simple questions. You know, how many transfers does your company do in a given year? What percentage are international? What percentage are domestic? What's your average fee? And one or two other questions. And I sent it out. And I've had a pretty good response. I mean, we're not talking hundreds and hundreds of people here. We're talking maybe 100. And at the moment, I'm on about 25%, which I think is a pretty good sort of result. And we're beginning to see a little bit, a sort of a picture is forming. It's pretty damned obvious that the industry is 75% international and only 25 or less % domestic. It's interesting, there are basically two, as far as I can work out, there are two types of DSP. There's the larger one, which are handling sort of anything from 1,500, 2,000 moves in a given year, to the smaller ones that are handling maybe 100 or under 100, but then there are smaller businesses with much less people involved. The fee side of it is interesting as well, but I'm not going to say anything at the moment about that. But basically, we're getting some results. And if anybody's watching this and they haven't sent me their information, I'd love to hear from you, because the more we get, the better the result we'll have. And Dominic and I were talking, and what we want to do is to roll this out across Europe, to get this information for the Germans, for the French, for the Belgians, for the Swiss, so that they can use similar information to go to their governments and say, look, you do realise that effectively we're sitting on top of an industry, and in the case of the UK, which is worth in excess of £4.5 billion a year, which is absolutely mind-blowing. I'm not suggesting that destination service companies or relocation management companies, for that matter, either are making huge pots of money, but it's everything. It's not just relocation companies, it's the wider industry, it's the furniture rental people, it's the moving people, it's the corporate housing people, it's essentially estate agents or realtors who are charging people for selling their properties, or charging people for renting properties, or whatever. But it is a massive industry. And on top of that, of course, it's what drives a lot of inward investment into countries from other countries. So this is this industry that we all sat in the shadows and thought of ourselves as being, not terribly important. Actually, if we collectively, we are important.
Incredibly important.
And actually, the thing that has proved that to me more than ever is how the Euro Global Congress has developed over the years and what happens there and what that's all about.
I mean, it is very interesting the way that, you know, the associations around the world, you know, have a role. And we were talking to Lynn Shotwell, who's the new CEO and president of WERC. Now, they have placed enormous amounts of money over the years in lobbying. That's why they're in DC. I mean, you know, Simon, from the point of view of being the chair of the ARP, obviously there aren't those funds available. But this is a really innovative start, a really innovative project.
It's a really innovative start, and it's a very positive one. Now, a few things that I would say already, and we're at the beginning of this journey, so I'd be really excited to come back to this, perhaps in maybe 3 or 4 weeks' time, perhaps, and see what we've learned and share that. But over this period, we have had a good number of MPs who have taken it very seriously. Our MP here has been extremely supportive. We had an ex-MP that is a friend of our industry and friend of our company, who's been very supportive. He's also a BBC journalist, has his own radio show, has invited us onto the show, has talked about that. So we got real profile. I've had the MP recently now come back to us to say that the issues that we've raised, and we have documented this quite carefully, has now been submitted through the Chancellor of the Exchequer's office.
That's amazing.
Actually look and discuss about this. Now, the reason why I share this is because a month ago, the idea that we as a group would have actually got our voice together well enough to actually go on to our MPs and actually reach Parliament and be on the BBC to talk about these things is quite simply kind of impossible to have considered. But here we are. So it is quite a positive statement to say in a very negative scenario that we are dramatically increasing the profile. We are an industry that is vital. It's an invisible part of the industry, but it's vital for multinational companies, to relocate their people into the UK or any nationality in the world. We are just that oil of the machine. So if that oil is not there, it is going to have an impact. So it is really exciting to see that we are increasing our profile. Long way to go, but that's what's happening in the UK, and hopefully other countries will be able to share their story too.
It's really impressive. I mean, definitely that's what, you know, we then plan to do over the coming weeks for Euro, is to use the structures that we put in place when we were building the index to get that data from the Euro members, as Tad said, in each country, and then send that data back so that, you know, we know most of the players in most of those regions who can then potentially form together. I mean, it's so much easier, Tad, for those countries who have their own professional associations. You just want to mention those a bit?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would hope that ABRA in Belgium will do this or will manage this.
You're going to talk to them all, right?
Yeah, I am going to. And then the SNPRM in France. That will be interesting because the SNPRM is more like the ARP in the sense that there are members of the SNPRM who are not members of Euro.
Yeah.
And they are obviously, they tend to be the slightly smaller companies, fairly obviously. And there's also SARA in Switzerland, but that's where it comes to an end. I think we'll also reach out to our friends in the USA, because I think we have all the major US DSPs as part of Euro. We can do some sort of figures for that one. And we'll do whatever we can for whoever we can to help them, because at the end of the day, if we believe that this is an industry that stands in the shadows in the UK, well, it blooming well stands in the shadows everywhere else as well. Even if the WERC in the States has a louder voice than us and does its own lobbying, it probably is not lobbying on behalf of people in our sector.
There's a very big difference between providers and the corporate.
Yeah, exactly. And they very well lobby on behalf of providers, but not specifically the sort of people that we're necessarily talking about. So it could be, I think it could be a very interesting project. And even if it doesn't matter if there's no financial gain, what matters is if we gain, we've become visual. If people see us, if people realise who we are.
What I was thinking was, and we were talking about this yesterday, Ted, you know, at this stage, like I say, this is about visibility, it's about lobbying, and that, you know, is, like I said, huge innovation, huge step forward. I was wondering what sort of, you know, what ultimate goals are going to be sort of put in place. And one thing that occurred to me, and this is just, you know, I don't know, our industry the international section of our industry obviously totally dependent on aviation. So when people start flying again, that's when we're going to need to hit the ground running. And Simon, I was thinking, I mean, we're not hearing anything yet, but if aviation is going to be phased back in, for example, I saw the other day that they've allowed flights for farm workers to come in, the people who always come in from Eastern Europe to help with the harvesting. If, for example, flights were to be phased back in, it would be fantastic for our industry to say, we've got all these moves waiting to happen, all these companies waiting to come in. Can we get some dispensation?
Absolutely. I think there's a few things that we need to actually recognize. First is we need to have the major flight paths reopened. Yes. And we need to recognize that these are between the major hubs around the world. So until they reopen, there are some limitations, even with technology. And I'm like you, a huge fan of technology, gets you so far. We've got to have these flights reopened again. The other aspect is that social distancing, I suspect, is going to be a part of our lives for perhaps the rest of the year or for rolling part of next year. So even when the flights reopen again, how are we going to best accommodate the home search? How are we best going to actually manage the removals? How are we best going to do the service accommodation? So I think what we need to do is actually have a view on this, share that with Parliament and the governments and say, well, this is actually how this could be best managed. And by actually having a clear set of rules about how we can do this, there's probably a better chance that they will then recognize us as an industry, recognize certain dispensational, certain types of processes, and that will give us as an industry another high profile, which allows us to go back to our clients and to government around the world to say, right, this is how we can deliver this key service. So I think there's quite a few things that we have got to watch carefully, flights and social distancing, probably being the top two.
That's brilliant. And again, that's kind of like, we definitely have to come back and talk about this in 3 or 4 weeks' time, because as you say, if there is then a kind of a roadmap of, best practice within mobility, given the situation that we're in when things start to open up, that's going to be key for every relocation company all over the world. So that's terrific. It has been really fascinating to speak to you both. Thank you so much. As I say, let's do this again in 2-3 weeks' time. And at that point, hopefully we'll have been able to roll out something for the Euro members as well, so that we can start pushing this data out there. But in the meantime, kudos to you guys. This has been a brilliant project. Well done.
Just to say one thing, please, if you're in the UK and you haven't responded, please respond. And when we roll this out to other countries, please treat this seriously and respond. It won't take you very long. It doesn't have to be 100% accurate. It just needs to be the sort of figures you believe to be true for your organization. And this will help everybody around the world if we get these answers in.
Absolutely, that's brilliant.
If I could just add a little bit on the back of that, I couldn't agree hard enough with you, Tad. When we're speaking to MPs and you actually say this is a multi-billion-pound industry in the UK, and you start showing how that is broken out and the impact of this, the difference in response you get from all parties is enormous. So the more data we can gather across the world on this to show what we perceive as the value and the impact, it's going to be extraordinary.
Well, if we think it's sort of in the region of 4 or 5 billion in this country, if you multiply that out, and we're talking about a massive amount of money across the world.
And it's not just that, it's the way that this industry helps the movement of that money and helps, basically global capitalism to.
And also, Dom, it's not just the people who are moving for work, it's the people who are moving with the people who are moving for work. Yeah. So it touches on education, it touches on all manner of different things which are important to a family who is being relocated.
Yeah, absolutely. That is an absolute truth, and I believe in everyone I've spoken to since this crisis has begun has said we're still really busy. We're not invoicing, but we're still supporting. We're supporting assignees. We're supporting people in crisis. We're supporting people who have suddenly been faced with this. And I was talking to, and I've said this in several interviews, but I was talking to Beverly Sun in Hong Kong, and she said that's because this industry is built from people who have passion and compassion. And I think that's never truer said. Thank you so much, guys. We'll catch up in 3 weeks' time. That would be brilliant. In the meantime, keep up the good work, and great to speak to you both.
Take care.
See you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.